They were told not to expect mercy. They were told they were fighting a war that wasn't theirs. They were told by their own country that they were not really soldiers, just bodies in uniform, men who would never be remembered as heroes. And then, in April 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed under the weight of its own crimes, Black American soldiers marched toward a place the world would struggle to understand for generations. They did not know they were about to walk into history. They did not know they were about to see proof of what hatred becomes when it is allowed to rule unchecked. What stood before them was not a battlefield. It was a camp, barbed wire, guard towers, barracks swollen with death, tens of thousands of prisoners reduced to walking skeletons, men who had been starved, beaten, and stripped of identity until survival itself became an act of defiance. The smell reached them before the truth did. Rotting wood, human waste, death so thick it felt alive. This was Stalag VII-A, the largest prisoner of war camp in Nazi Germany, and it was already collapsing into chaos. The soldiers froze, not because they were afraid of gunfire, but because nothing in their training had prepared them for this. They had crossed the Atlantic wearing the uniform of a nation that segregated them, denied them dignity, and told them their lives mattered less. Now they stood face to face with the final destination of that same belief system. Racism fully realized. Dehumanization made policy. Suffering turned into routine. Inside the wire were Americans who looked at them in disbelief. Soviet soldiers who had been worked nearly to death. Jews who had survived extermination camps only to be recaptured. Men who no longer trusted hope because hope had betrayed them too many times. Liberation did not look like celebration. It looked like silence, tears, and bodies too weak to stand. In that moment, these black soldiers understood something the world was only beginning to grasp. Evil does not start with gas chambers. It starts with laws, with categories, with deciding who counts and who does not. And standing at those gates, men denied freedom in their own country became the ones who delivered it. By the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent in ruins. Cities lay shattered, roads were choked with debris, and millions of civilians were moving across the landscape with nowhere left to go. The Third Reich was collapsing, but it was collapsing violently, dragging as many lives as possible into the wreckage. American forces pushed deeper into Germany, encountering resistance in some places and eerie silence in others. Entire towns surrendered without a shot fired. Others were already abandoned, their populations fleeing the approaching Allied armies. For Black American soldiers, the war had always carried a double weight. They fought the enemy overseas while navigating segregation within their own ranks. Units were separated by race. Command positions were almost exclusively white. Black soldiers were routinely assigned labor and support roles, even as casualties mounted on the front lines. They built bridges under fire, cleared mines, repaired roads, and recovered bodies, all while being reminded that they were considered expendable. One such unit was the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, activated in 1943, whom they trained in the Jim Crow South, where they endured harassment from civilians and humiliation from military, police enforcing segregation laws. Even in uniform, even in service to their country, they were denied the basic respect granted to white soldiers. Yet when the unit shipped out to Europe, they performed every task given to them with precision and discipline, pushing through France and into Germany alongside frontline divisions. As April approached, intelligence reports spoke of prisoner-of-war camps scattered across Bavaria. Many had been abandoned by German guards as defeat became inevitable. Commanders believed most camps held only Allied soldiers and expected little resistance. Engineer units were ordered to clear roads and secure surrounding areas. No one prepared them for what they would find. No one warned them that the camps were not merely holding facilities, but engines of slow destruction. And no one told these soldiers that the next assignment would force them to confront a truth that would forever reshape how they understood both the enemy and their own country. Private James Mitchell was 23 years old when he crossed into Germany. He came from Mobile, Alabama, a city shaped by slavery, segregation, and silence. His grandfather had been born in chains. His father had lived his entire life under Jim Crow. Mitchell grew up learning when to lower his eyes, when to step off sidewalks, when silence was safer than protest. By the time he enlisted, he understood that his uniform would not protect him from racism, but it would give him a purpose larger than himself. Mitchell was assigned to the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, an all-black unit commanded almost entirely by white officers. The men trained in the Deep South, where they were denied entry to restaurants and harassed by military police, while German prisoners of war ate freely in the same towns. The message was unmistakable. They were needed but not valued. They were soldiers but not equals. Despite this, the battalion developed a fierce sense of brotherhood. They learned to trust each other completely because the army often did not. They cleared minefields under fire. They built bridges while artillery fell nearby. They repaired roads so tanks could advance, then slept in ditches while white units took shelter. Survival depended on discipline, skill, and loyalty to the man beside you. Their commanding officer, Captain Robert Whitfield, was a white engineer from Ohio who slowly came to respect his men through shared danger. He had been raised in a segregated America and entered the army with its assumptions intact. Combat dismantled them. Watching black soldiers perform impossible tasks under fire forced him to confront truths he had never questioned. By the time the battalion reached Bavaria, Whitfield understood that these men were not support troops. They were veterans. Each soldier carried his own reasons for being there. Some hoped military service might earn them respect back home. Others simply wanted a paycheck or an escape from poverty. Few believed the war would change America. None of them expected that what awaited them behind barbed wire would redefine what the word freedom truly meant. The orders came without urgency. Clear the roads. Secure the area. Move on. Intelligence suggested a prisoner of war camp near the town of Moosburg, but nothing indicated it was different from the dozens already encountered. German resistance in the region had largely collapsed. Guards were fleeing. Civilians waved white flags from windows. To command, this was routine. To the men of the 183rd, it felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that settles in places where something has already gone terribly wrong. As they advanced, signs of human presence multiplied. Discarded uniforms, shallow pits in the earth. The smell arrived before the camp itself, drifting on the cold air, heavy and unmistakable. Death has a language of its own, and every man in that column recognized it. When the first watchtowers emerged through the mist, conversations stopped. Barbed wire stretched across the horizon. Barracks sagged inward as if exhausted. This was not a holding facility. This was containment. They reached the outer perimeter and found no guards. The gates stood partially open, abandoned in haste. Inside, movement caught their attention. Shapes shifted between buildings, slow and unsteady. At first, the soldiers mistook them for civilians. Then they got closer. These were men reduced to bone and skin, dressed in rags, their faces hollowed by hunger and disease. Some stared in disbelief. Others turned away, convinced this was another deception. What they didn't know was that Stalag VII-A had held over 70,000 prisoners at its peak. Men from across Europe deliberately mixed to fracture solidarity and intensify suffering. What they didn't know was that disease had spread unchecked for weeks, that starvation had already claimed thousands, that the guards had fled knowing there would be no consequences for the dead left behind. As the soldiers stepped inside, the full weight of the camp pressed down on them. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Barracks reeked of rot and despair. Every step forward revealed another layer of cruelty. And with each discovery, the tension grew, because it became clear this mission was no longer about orders. It was about bearing witness to something that could never be undone. The truth revealed itself piece by piece, and each piece made the last harder to bear. This was not chaos born of retreat. It was design. Inside the camp headquarters, American soldiers found records stacked neatly on desks, lists of names, dates, causes of death written with bureaucratic precision. Starvation, disease, execution, work to death. The handwriting was calm, methodical, as if documenting machinery instead of human lives. The Nazis had not hidden what they had done. They had archived it. Barracks that had been labeled as infirmaries were nothing more than waiting. Rooms for death. Men lay stacked on wooden bunks, too weak to move, their eyes tracking the soldiers with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Some whispered. Some cried. Some had already slipped beyond the point where liberation mattered. Outside, mass graves scarred the earth, hastily covered, their contents revealed by the smell and the disturbed soil. Death was everywhere, and it had been allowed to work without interruption. What stunned the black soldiers most was the familiarity of the logic behind it. Prisoners were categorized, ranked, deemed useful or disposable. Rights removed incrementally until none remained. The system did not begin with murder. It began with labels, with laws, with the insistence that some lives mattered less than others. Standing inside Stalag VII-A, these men recognized the end of a road they had been forced to walk since childhood. Among the prisoners were Jews, who had survived extermination, camps only to be transferred here, Soviet soldiers treated with particular cruelty, and political prisoners whose only crime had been resistance. Their suffering was different in form but identical in outcome. They had been reduced to objects to be consumed by policy. In that moment, the illusion of distance collapsed. Nazi ideology was not an alien monstrosity. It was the logical extreme of ideas the soldiers knew well. Racism, stripped of restraint. Dehumanization perfected, and once seen clearly, it could never be unseen. Liberation did not end the suffering. In many ways, it revealed how deep it ran. American medics moved quickly, setting up aid stations and distributing food. But the damage had already gone too far for many. Starved bodies could not process rich rations. Some prisoners collapsed after eating. Others clung to bread as if it might vanish again. Death continued, even after the gates were open, claiming men who had survived years of brutality only to perish in freedom's shadow. The soldiers of the 183rd became caretakers as much as liberators. They carried men who weighed almost nothing. They cleaned wounds that had never been treated. They listened to stories that spilled out in fragments, in broken English, in silence punctuated by tears. For many prisoners, seeing black American soldiers was disorienting. Nazi propaganda had painted them as subhuman. Reality stood in front of them, offering water, lifting bodies, refusing to look away. German guards who were found were detained. Most claimed ignorance. They spoke of orders, of fear, of survival. The excuses sounded familiar. The black soldiers recognized the pattern immediately. Responsibility diluted until it disappeared. Cruelty justified as obedience. It was the same logic that allowed segregation to endure at home. Scaled up to mass death, as journalists arrived and photographs circulated, the world was forced to confront what had been hidden in plain sight. Americans celebrated the liberation of camps while ignoring the contradiction it exposed. Black soldiers who had helped stop genocide returned to a country that still denied them the right to vote, to eat where they chose, to live without fear. There were no parades for the third, no headlines recorded their names. But something irreversible had happened. The men who walked through Stalag VII-A carried that knowledge home. They understood with absolute clarity where dehumanization leads, and they would never again accept the lie that injustice could remain contained, that it could exist without consequence. When the war ended in May 1945, the gates of Stalag VII-A were closed forever. But what happened there did not stay in Germany. The men of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion returned to the United States, carrying memories they rarely spoke aloud. They went back to segregated trains, segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods, and a nation eager to forget the contradictions the war had exposed. They were expected to be silent. Many tried. Few succeeded. Private James Mitchell went home to Alabama and built a life as best he could. He married, raised children, and eventually became a teacher. But the images never left him. The hollow eyes, the weight of bodies that felt unreal in his arms, the understanding that racism was not merely cruelty but a blueprint for destruction. When the civil rights movement began to rise, men like Mitchell understood immediately what was at stake. They had already seen the end of that road. The story of black soldiers liberating Nazi camps is rarely taught. It disrupts comfortable narratives. It forces difficult questions. How can a nation fight racial genocide abroad while enforcing racial hierarchy at home? How can freedom be delivered by those denied it? History often chooses silence when the truth is inconvenient. Stalag VII-A was not Auschwitz or Dachau, but its lesson was no less urgent. It showed that dehumanization does not require gas chambers to be lethal. It only requires permission. The men who opened those gates had been denied dignity their entire lives. Yet they chose to extend it to strangers. In doing so, they proved that humanity is not granted by law or uniform. It is claimed through action. This story matters because the forces that built that camp did not vanish in 1945. They retreat. They adapt. They wait. Remembering who stood against them and why is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of defense. And the question remains now as it did then. When faced with dehumanization, who will open the gates and who will look away?